that much about it. I know a few people have recommended we cover Voltaire, and so it got in my mind. It seems, especially apropos since we just did McIntyre in his contra Enlightenment thing, to actually read somebody who represents the Enlightenment. Nobody represents the Enlightenment like Voltaire. He was skating the trends. He was the man. Descartes and Newton and those guys might have actually produced the substance, but Voltaire, he was the style.
Well, yeah, and he's got a certain kind of not merely embracing relationship with the Enlightenment, right? If Descartes' a member of the Enlightenment, he's certainly no friend to Descartes in that respect.
Yes.
Right. He defended the new Newtonian mechanics against the old Cartesian and, to some extent, Leibnizian mechanics, although those are very different things.
And I didn't really ever understand what the substance of that debate was. Do we even want to try to address it in a couple sentences?
I think some of it has to do with the idea of gravity being action at a distance. I think for early mechanics, I think Descartes and others embraced the intuitive idea that for bodies to act on each other, they had to be touching. And so if you couldn't see them actually touching each other and imposing force on each other that way, it worked through the ether, through some sort of hydraulics or fluid mechanics, let's say. I'm not really sure of the details.
Vortex.
Okay.
Vortices.
Okay, vortices. So Newton just said, no, it's action at a distance, and we don't need these hypotheses about these intermediate causal factors or mechanisms like vortices.
Newton explicitly says, I solved this problem, but I'm not going to really worry about what the fundamental metaphysics of it is. So part of the reason for the insistence on things touching, and for someone like Descartes, was a kind of metaphysical predisposition to have causes accounted for, differently than Leibniz would do it, but nonetheless explicitly requiring the cause. Whereas Newton, it says, well, they act at a distance, it acts in this way, I can show it rationally, mathematically. There's more to be said about it, but I'm not going to really worry about it. I should have brought my Principia.
No, you should not have brought your Principia.
There's a very famous quote about this in Newton.
Something like, I offer no hypothesis.
That is exactly what it is. I offer no hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so that's either scandalous or brilliant, depending on what you think. In some ways, it's pragmatic. In some ways, it's the beginning of the worst part of science and sort of not being worried about efficient things. Or only being worried about efficient things. And also the sort of very pragmatic part of science, which says, I'm going to try to solve this problem. And if I have to sort it out later, I'll sort it out later.
Well, it's a movement away from worrying about mechanisms specifically, right?
Metaphysical mechanism.
Yeah. So you have these bodily movements that are correlated, and you can write equations for that, and that's your science. And if you can't really do anything empirically to establish a mechanism, then you have to forget about that. Leibniz is actually a whole different can of worms, because he invented the calculus simultaneously with Newton, and he made great contributions to science, including kinetic energy. But Leibniz still wanted to talk about the metaphysical basis, say, of kinetic energy, which he called vis viva. So Leibniz was still wedded to this early rationalist speculation that was part of science then. And with Newton, you're getting away from that. And I think that's what Voltaire embraces, this sort of hardline empiricist approach.
All right. Well, to celebrate getting rid of action at a distance, and because my wife is down here taking pictures, which you can see on the website, I must come over to you and strike you.
What am I supposed to do in response to that?
You're supposed to say, ouch. You're supposed to get it.
Yeah, so
right. Okay, here's the picture.
Ow!
I'm just wondering if anybody has ever uttered the phrase before, I should have brought my Principia with me.
Come to St. John's.
All right. But the thing that we came to talk about today was the Candide, was his ethical philosophy, his view on philosophy, for one thing.
Or one particular philosopher, at least.
Yes. His objection to Descartes and Leibniz in particular,
Leibniz, really.
Right, his rationalism, how that extended to the problem of evil, which I believe Wes read all about. Do you want to fill us in? Or as a high level, before we go into that detail, Candide is just about a guy running around and a lot of crappy stuff happens to him, and his teacher at the beginning of the story was a Leibniz disciple who insisted that this is the best of all possible worlds, and showing by example that is an unsupportable thesis. So there's a hugely oversimplistic way of reacting to the philosophical content of the book.
So say what the problem of evil is. The problem is that there's a lot of evil in the world, and if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, you would think he would be capable of creating a world without evil or without so much evil. And so it looks like an argument against the existence of God, although at that time it was more an argument about God's nature, whether God was benevolent and all-powerful and so on and so forth. So you can take it either as, well, there must not be a God because God is by definition all-powerful and all-knowing, or you could take an alternative route and say, well, God must have certain limitations because of the existence of evil.
It's also probably worth noting that this subtitle Optimism, that optimism is kind of a popular culture thing. This notion of optimism at the time and this philosophy of Leibniz's is a kind of phenomenon in the 1750s, something like that, as an answer to the question of evil, which is sort of occupying some part of the public consciousness, that the response would be by one of the eminent thinkers, well, this is the best of all possible worlds, and therefore there's got to be compensating factors for whatever evil you have. There's something good to be seen in it, and then therefore you have optimism.
Well, Leibniz's solution is kind of a version of a lot of earlier scholastic thinkers, St. Augustine, for instance, where you can go a number of routes. You can say, well, on the whole, the world is really, really good. It's if you look at the specific parts of the world, you can say, okay, this specific thing that happened is evil and so on and so forth. But if you looked at the big picture, you would see that it's good and actually is the best, because God would be required to pick the best of all possible worlds. So that's basically Leibniz's route. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
It makes a lot of sense to me that Leibniz would want to think about it this way, both because of his universalism and as an inventor of differential calculus and integral calculus, and the inventor of, vis viva, the notion of energy. He wants to take the whole and say the whole is some kind of extreme, and the way in which the individual components of it are behaving, that you have individual evils and individual discrepancies, doesn't matter to the fact that the whole both is one thing that has to have some kind of characteristic, and two, that it is an extremum of some sort. That is, it's the best.
So it's like taking a summation in calculus.
Yes,
you get a much different result than just the individual infinitesimals.
That's right. You could have an infinite number of numbers that you add and subtract from one another, and you get one. That infinite series will converge to that, and he is one of the people who does a lot of work on these kinds of infinite series. Each of those individual parts don't detract from the fact that there's this one extremum that's utterly perfect. And there's that kind of universalist thinking going on. It also reminded me a little bit of things like Kant's question of the philanthropic right to lie, where he argues that you shouldn't do that, really on the basis of a kind of universal good, that lying just contributes to the lack of goodness in the world. And so there's no justification for doing it. It's the same kind of thing, that you understand each individual, each action, each happening as being radically part of a whole, not individual in its own right.
Yeah, I don't want to jump too much in the book to try to address what Wes just brought up about scholastic history, but at least Voltaire is pretty clearly calling out Leibniz's rationalism and his getting to this conclusion of the best of all possible worlds a priori. He's not thinking that it's Leibniz saying, well, this part might be bad and this part might be bad, but on the whole it's good. In fact, there's no empirical content whatsoever to Leibniz's assertion, and that's precisely what the book is kind of. So in that sense, it's not coming from that same tradition or that same line of thinking anyway that you mentioned.
Yeah, and actually Leibniz's argument is a little bit different from this line of thinking. This is just a simpler way to put it. Leibniz actually has a more sophisticated variation of this. The whole is more than the sum of its evil parts. But it's interesting, the way Voltaire goes at Leibniz and Candide. One of Leibniz's doctrines involves the plenum, which is to say that in the best of all possible worlds, every possibility is actualized. He thinks of possibilities as these things striving to sort of come into being, and they're actually, because of his theory of monads, they're not inconsistent with each other, so they can all be realized. So you get even though there's a simplicity of scientific laws, you get this maximal variety in the world, which is a good thing, including, so for instance, all the variations in forms of species and subspecies. And what's interesting about Candide is you get that sense of a plenum of all this stuff happening, except most of it is bad. It's like he's teasing Leibniz. Yes, every possibility is actualized, but most of the possibilities suck.
Yeah. And listeners who aren't aware, we do have a previous episode on Leibniz that it might be worth your time to go back and listen to, because a lot of the stuff that Leibniz says sounds really crazy until you spend a little time with it, and then you understand that it's
totally awesome.
It's totally awesome.
You gotta smoke a joint and really sit down and appreciate it.
I think it's a significant rhetorical move that Voltaire is not attempting to parse Leibniz's argument, that it's much like my dismissal of slavery in the recent Aristotle episode. This is such an obviously bullshit thing that I'm not going to take your argument and parse it apart because it's bullshit and it's not worth my time. And that goes into Voltaire's overall eschewal. Is that a word? Eschewal? Rejection.
I've never heard anyone use it, actually.
A rejection of metaphysics as being more or less a waste of time. There was even something, so he wrote this philosophical dictionary, which has just a lot of little bits and pieces, little tiny essays on a lot of different...
Like testicles.
Yes, we were reading something before we started that he has an entry on testicles.
In his philosophical dictionary.
Yes.
It's more like a funny-sophical dictionary.
One of the things I was reading about that is, one of the places, I forget what metaphysical topic he's talking about, but pretty much he stops, says, happily, none of this really matters for our action. Which view you have in the metaphysics here is not going to affect your morality either way. And so that's what he was ultimately concerned about. He was... his big objections to Descartes and Leibniz and it was to the intellectual climate that they were creating in France at the time. And he didn't like that. He liked politically, he was a anti-authoritarian. He was a liberal of some sort. The French Revolution, which, who knows whether he would have approved of that or not, but they considered Voltaire one of their main influences. So if you think this is the best of all possible worlds, then it's not a great motivation to go politically to do something to improve things, to get new people in power, etc. That was the main problem, that, he liked Cartesian doubt, for instance, but then thought that Descartes cheated and didn't really even have an argument for God. He kind of did the same thing with Descartes on God in the philosophical dictionary that he does to Leibniz here. He doesn't actually go in and, of course, he must have read the Meditations. It's not long. It was a major thing, but he doesn't feel the need to dive in and parse it up, at least that I'm aware of. There are probably folks listening that are more familiar with. Actually, from what I understand, pretty much nobody is, unless you're a historian of that period, is deeply familiar with the philosophical work of Voltaire. That he's just not one of the guys that's on their radar. But in any case,
from what he wrote was plays and poems and other things.
Yes. And when he did do philosophy, most of what he did, right? He wrote
hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff, thousands of pages.
And he wrote Candide in, 2 weeks or something, I heard?
Yeah, when he was 65 years old.
Yeah, it was a very dashed
more
off.
than 20,000 letters, and
he was basically a blogger.
Prolific. Yeah. And basically a blogger of his day. And Dylan, you were mentioning the printing press.
Exactly.
It's a new technology the way the internet is new to us. So.
Right. So, it's not that he took Descartes' arguments, for instance, and parsed them out, and I'm participating in the Philosophical Academy, and this is my objection to my predecessors. He wasn't playing that game. He was taking it from a populist angle and saying, this is pretty obviously bullshit. I approve of the overall skeptical tone. So actually, as a sort of a philosopher as a whole, he comes down we had a Montaigne episode in the skeptical tradition. And much like Montaigne, one of his big complaints is about people's overestimation of the intellect and really what metaphysicians can you really come up with anything? It's not that there's something attractive about the enterprise doing philosophy. It's rich intellectual work, but what you come up with is not necessarily something it's not going to save the world. You don't need to go to the depths that metaphysicians do to tend your garden, as the book concludes.
Did you just spoil that?
I
Did you
spoiled
throw a
it.
spoiler out there?
So skepticism was very influential at this time. There's sort of a revival of, at some point, the work by Sextus Empiricus, an ancient skeptic, had been published, and it's very influential on Descartes and Montaigne. And I think via Descartes and Montaigne on Voltaire. I don't think he was digging deep into the classics necessarily. Well, no, actually, Voltaire had a strong classic education in Latin.
Rich guy.
Yeah.
Grew up rich.
But the point is that for Descartes, skepticism was really methodological. He was trying to get beyond skepticism by using that as a starting point to flesh out these solid foundations that were really where you could erect some structure, which was beyond skepticism. And for Montaigne, and I think for Voltaire, skepticism is really, to some extent, an endpoint that really informs the way you live life.
Yeah, I think in Candide, as both funny and acerbic as it is, there's a real background preoccupation with, well, what does this mean to the way you live your life? And even the things he's making fun of satirically and the extreme kind of behaviors of the army and the events that happen, to me, point back to him just saying, that is not a very enjoyable way to live, and just being preoccupied with sort of living decently, not even the idea of living well.